Now, Ukraine's foreign minister says if Russia wants peace, it must hold a ceasefire immediately. It says Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a surprise three-day ceasefire in Ukraine from the 8th of May. The Kremlin says this coincides with Moscow's World War II Victory Day commemorations. The announcement comes after Donald Trump questioned the Russian leader's willingness to halt the three-year offensive. The Kremlin says it's ready to hold peace talks without preconditions, but it hasn't agreed to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, which was originally proposed by Washington and which Ukraine backs. Earlier, Mr. Putin thanked the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, for providing troops to help Russia fight Ukraine. And our correspondent John Donnison is in Kyiv for us. John, hello to you. What's the reaction there?
Well, it's one of scepticism. I mean, I think what you've got here is President Putin trying to signal to President Trump and the Americans that it's not the Russians who are blocking peace. So what he is proposing is a three-day ceasefire starting on the 8th of May. It'll run till the 11th, and he's doing that for what he calls humanitarian reasons. But certainly here in Ukraine, a lot of scepticism. The foreign minister calling it a parade and questioning why we can't just have a ceasefire immediately, and why the Russians have been rejecting this request from the Americans to have a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The Russians have been rejecting that for weeks. So, you know, I guess any news of a ceasefire, potential ceasefire, is good news, but let's wait to see if it happens, and let's wait to see if it holds, because of course the last Russian ceasefire, which was for 30 hours over the Easter holiday weekend, well, that was really a ceasefire in all but name, and we had numerous breaches from both sides and no real ceasefire to note, really.
And a big difference, John, between 3 days and 30 days, which you were alluding to. Of course, that proposal originally came from the US. And I wonder if Ukraine is hoping that the US might be minded to pivot back towards thinking about a 30-day ceasefire more.
Well, that is certainly what Ukraine wants. President Zelensky again said over the weekend that what Ukraine wants is a 30-day unconditional ceasefire from land, air and sea, and only then, only when that is established, will they be prepared to enter into more comprehensive talks about territory, about Ukraine's future security. Now, it's interesting because we've been reacting over the weekend every time President Trump speaks, but he seems to say something a little bit different every day. So one moment he's criticizing President Zelensky and calling him inflammatory and saying he's harder to deal with than President Putin. The next day, of course, or a few days later, we had that meeting in the Vatican with President Zelensky and Mr. Trump tete-a-tete in the Vatican, and chewing over things, and we heard much more positive comments from Mr. Trump, and basically saying it was Mr. Putin who was tapping him along or stringing him along, as Mr. Trump put it. So, you know, I think we just have to wait and see until we get something concrete in place, and we can't really just keep reacting to every single thing Donald Trump says.
OK, John, thank you very much. John Donnison there in the Ukrainian capital. And we can speak now to former US Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. Bill, thank you very much indeed for your time joining us today on BBC News. So is this announcement from Russia, in your opinion, linked to that criticism that John was just talking about, that criticism that Donald Trump made about Vladimir Putin, wondering if he was just stringing him along?
I think it is. I think you're right, Anita. I think John's right. That is, President Putin has recognized, has observed that President Trump is running out of patience with President Putin. This has been a trend, as you've just reported, over the last week or so, where it's very clear who's holding up the discussions of a ceasefire and a broader settlement, and it's Vladimir Putin. And John just indicated that President Trump and President Zelensky agreed on a 30-day comprehensive ceasefire, air, land, and sea, just as John said, and President Putin turned it down. Now President Putin comes back and says, well, let's have a 3-day ceasefire, like the one that wasn't observed over Easter. So the Ukrainians can be forgiven to be a little skeptical of this proposal from President Putin.
Yeah, and until the last few days, really, the language from the US administration has resolutely, I think, been more favourable towards Vladimir Putin and towards Russia. I think a lot of people would agree. So do you think that Donald Trump and his team are in all seriousness now reviewing and potentially revising their thinking on this?
I do think so, Anita. I think so. And I think that tete-a-tete in the Vatican between President Trump and President Zelensky had some real effect. I've also heard that the proposal, the ceasefire proposal that the Americans had put forward to the Ukrainians and to the Russians, which, as you say, was generally received as pretty lopsided, pretty favorable to the Russians, that proposal may be undergoing some changes. That proposal may now reflect some of the discussions that the Americans have had with the Ukrainians and the discussions the Americans have had with the Europeans in London last week. So there is I think you're exactly right to say there is a shift in focus for the Americans to be supportive of the Ukrainians and to be skeptical and indeed even impatient with the Russians.
And where does all of this leave Mr. Trump's time frame for America's involvement in this process and their willingness to continue or not?
Well, they've said a couple of times, and Secretary Rubio has made this point as well, that it can't take forever. But they've now talked about weeks, not days. And weeks, it's going to take weeks in order to come to some kind of an agreement on a ceasefire. The outline of that ceasefire, as I say, is emerging, is evolving, but to incorporate the European and Ukrainian suggestions and then go back to the Russians to get their agreement, it may take some pressure to get their agreement. It's going to take more than days. It's going to take several weeks. And my understanding is that the administration, the U.S. administration, is willing to do that for the next couple of weeks, not for the next couple of months.
OK, really good to hear your thoughts on all of that. Bill Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita.